Today our main discussion is on the anatomy of the brain. To make our topic more organized, I have put in my objectives that I want to be talking to you about. First thing is the orientation of the brain, about the sides of the brain in the sections. Next I'll be talking about the sulci and gyri. These are the depressions and the elevations in the brain, which we use as landmarks to make the different lobes, to identify different parts of the brain. And then there are certain connections where one part of the brain is communicating with the other part of the brain. So how are these connections in the brain? We'll be learning that. And lastly, we'll also be learning the function of each part of the brain. This is my potato face here to orient us towards the brain. This is the face in front of the potato. Now, the front is always called anterior in medical terms. The behind is called posterior. And these are the two lateral sides. When you draw a midline through it, it's anything closer to the midline is called medial. So anterior, posterior, lateral, anything in the near to the midline is called medial. Okay, to understand the sections of the brain, this particular, if I cut the potato in this line, if I cut, it is called coronal plane. Coronal, remember it with the crown on the head, coronal plane. This is the sagittal plane, which goes through midline, going horizontally this way to the face. This is transverse plane. Okay, transverse, sagittal and coronal planes. We need to understand these planes when we are discussing the inner parts of the brain. We'll get a particular orientation when I say when I show you other views of the brain to describe internal parts. When I show you a transverse plane, you need to imagine how the brain was sliced to see that particular part in the brain, or the sagittal plane or the coronal plane. Okay, now this is the face. This is coronal, sagittal and horizontal or transverse plane. Now we've got an orientation about anterior, posterior, lateral, medial and different sections, that is coronal, sagittal and horizontal. Now let us discuss about the different lobes in the brain. Anteriorly we have the frontal lobe, which is right behind our forehead. Behind frontal lobe is the parietal lobe, which extends a little posterior to your brain. Totally posterior to your brain is the occipital lobe. On the lateral sides we have the temporal lobe. So we have 4 different lobes in the brain, that is frontal, parietal, occipital and temporal. If you see this image of the brain, it's never a smooth surface. It has all crevices. There are so many depressions and elevations all over the brain. The depressions are called sulci, the elevations are called gyri. Now these sulci help us in identifying different lobes. So if you see this sulci, which is really long, it's gone up to here. This particular sulci is dividing the temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes. Okay, so this is identified as a temporal lobe because of the presence of the lateral sulcus. If you see this sulcus coming all the way up to here, it's almost touching the lateral sulci. This is called the central sulcus. This central sulcus is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. Okay, the next one is parieto-occipital sulcus. This particular sulcus is separating our occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. Alright, now let's quickly understand the functions of the lobes, as we have understood the lobes and the orientation of the brain, starting with the frontal lobe, which is in front of the head. This lobe is the boss of the brain, in fact. Most of the motor functions are executed from this lobe and sent to the muscle that needs to be moved. It also takes care of the emotions. If this part of the brain is damaged, the person would not understand how to express the emotions. It also takes care of the behavior of the person. Next, coming to the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is most important for the sensations. It's a sensory headquarter. Next, the occipital lobe. This is the visual headquarter. Next, the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is very important for the memory, speaking, thinking, and understanding what you've heard and comprehending it, and then giving back a reply is done in the temporal lobe. With this potato head, we have understood that the brain is not only one side, but it has two. Each side is called a hemisphere. So the brain has two hemispheres. A sphere is an entire ball. Hemisphere is half of a ball. Alright, the brain has two hemispheres. Now, how is this communicating? One part of the brain, how is it giving information to the other part of the brain? There are a lot of connections, wires inside the brain connecting one part to the other. They are called white fibers of the brain. One of the most important white fiber of the brain that we have to remember is the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres together. Don't panic right away. This is quite a busy picture right now. But when we divide this and understand different parts, it gets very easy. Now, how are we seeing this brain? How is the brain sliced to have this view? Which one is anterior side, which one is posterior side? Can you identify? If you are thinking this is anterior, yes, you're right. This is nothing but the nose, inside of the nose. This is the anterior side. So this makes the frontal lobe. This is the posterior side. So this is the occipital lobe. You cannot appreciate the temporal lobe in this because this is cut in the sagittal plane. Right, it is cut in the sagittal plane here. So the temporal lobe is gone. If we come into more details in the brain, you remember I was telling you that the two hemispheres of the brain are connected with a thick white fiber communications, which is called as corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum inside the brain, which we can see in the sagittal section. Let's come to the other parts of the brain. The other parts of the brain are the brainstem, the cerebellum, the thalamus, and the cortex. This is the brainstem. This is the cerebellum. This is the thalamus. Thalamus going into hypothalamus, and the cortex. Brainstem contains of three different parts again. It has midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. These three things take care of our circulation, respiration, and digestion. So any problem in the brainstem will lead to problems with swallowing difficulties, digestive problem, respiratory disturbances, and circulation problems, like the patient might not be able to maintain proper blood pressure. Now, behind the brainstem we have the cerebellum. Cerebellum mostly takes care of the movement, coordinated movements. Now, any problem in this cerebellum, the patient might not be able to move his hand or leg in a coordinated way with the other hand and leg. The patient might be looking very clumsy. The next part we want to see is the thalamus. The thalamus here is mostly taking care of all the information. It's like post office manager who's sitting there and sending the information or the letters to the particular addresses. Alright, so this is sitting here. All the information that comes, it sorts out to all the parts of the brain. That is what the thalamus does. Below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. This hypothalamus is very important in regulating the body temperature. It's called homeostasis. After the thalamus, hypothalamus, it continues down into this ball-like structure here. This is the master gland of the body. It's called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is again divided into anterior and posterior. It's called the master gland because this secretes the hormones which will go and trigger the other glands which secrete other hormones. Now, if we go further, 80% of the brain is formed by the cortex. The cortex we've already seen the different lobes, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. Now as we have seen different parts of the brain now, let us just quickly discuss about how everything is working together so smoothly. Alright, now yesterday we have discussed about the synapse, which is the communication between the nerves. Synapse has to move in two directions, right? The brain should send some signal down to the body. The body should send some signals up to the brain. That is mostly done through our brainstem. Our cortex mostly does the integration of the information that is being sent. It integrates here and then sends another response down this way. Now that is called the sensory responses. The sensory sensations from the other parts of the body goes up. They are called ascending fibers. The ascending fibers take the information from the body to the brain, and the brain in the cortex, it digests the information, integrates it and sends down the information called as descending fibers. How is the brain sliced, and where is the front, where is the back? Now we'll use our potato face again. Now this, by seeing this, can you tell me how was the brain sliced? If you are thinking if the brain was sliced transversely, you are right. Now this view of the brain is cut transversely and seen from below. Alright? Now this is the front of the brain and this is the back of the brain. That makes this a frontal lobe and this the occipital lobe. And this is the temporal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, temporal and parietal. Alright? Now that is the orientation of this particular picture. We can make out the corpus callosum here that we have seen before. Alright? Now this view is important for us because of the of an important structure that we have to learn, that is called the basal nuclei. Basal nuclei is again composed of three different structures. What is the importance of the basal nucleus? The basal nucleus is mostly taking care of the body movements. Yesterday we have discussed about the dopamine and how dopamine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter and how it is helping in the body movements. That all happens here. This area of the basal nucleus has another structure called substantia nigra, which is a very concentrated part containing dopamine releasing neurons. That particular part, if it is affected, will lead to a disease called as Parkinson's disease. Now the quick review of what we have learned till now in the brain anatomy. We have gotten ourselves oriented to the brain, the structures inside it, different lobes and their functions, the interior parts of the brain and their functions. Can you recall quickly what is the connection called which is connecting two hemispheres? Are you thinking corpus callosum? Then you are right. It is the white fibers connecting both hemispheres of the brain. Now, what is the function of the temporal lobe? Are you thinking right? It also takes care of your memory, it takes care of your speech and ability to understand.